So I'm going to take moderator's privilege for the first question and try to tease out a little more of what you were saying there about the conflicts of interest. Because you've gone and spoken now to quite a lot of companies and a lot of designers about these ideas. And to tie this in a little bit to what we talk about here at Data and Society, obviously one of the reasons that the attention economy works the way it does is that a lot of these companies offer services which are, in quotes, free, which means that they're offering them to you in return for your data.
Yep.
They need as much of your data as possible. In order to get as much of your data as possible, they need as much of your attention as possible.
Yes.
And that's where one of the fundamental conflicts of interest seems to be. So how does that come up when you go and talk to these companies, and how do you answer that problem of essentially their existential crisis around this?
Yep. So for businesses whose business model is engagement based, so it's not just data, right? I mean, if I have no data from you and I can just put an ad in front of you, I can make money from that. Data is just the optimization on top of that to make that ad worth a lot more than what it would be if I didn't know anything about you. So there's sort of different tiers. There's an attention economy that's sort of like the 1995 attention economy, where ads just show up and the goal is to get you to spend as much time as possible. But in that world, we weren't very persuasive yet at getting people to spend lots of time. So for any business model, for any business, website, app that is that has the business model of time spent being the proxy, this does conflict with what they can do. So if I walked into YouTube or to Twitter or to Facebook, and I was actually speaking to Facebook's whole product design team 2 weeks ago, they can't do a lot of these changes because it would conflict with their business model. But I think the thing that I'm concerned about is whether or not that distinction ever gets made, versus there's sort of a self-deception that getting people to spend more time is improving their life, as opposed to we're just trying to get people to spend more time. And it correlates with life benefit, but it's not on my team. So you can't do it until there is some mark that basically, well, I mean, so you don't have to have the mark, but people do have to pay for, so there has to be an alternative business model or an augmentation of money coming in, which can be subscription, can be freemium type models and things like that. But it's the unbounded desire to take your time. That's the fundamental issue. It's not advertising at large. It's the specific form in which people have an incentive to get eyeballs glued on screens for minutes.
Right, and as you say, one of the driving forces could be that there's an alternative. So as with organic food, once there is an alternative organic food industry, that in itself maybe creates a certain incentive for the other producers to shift.
That's right.
At the very least, the way they market their products, if not actually the content. So
exactly.
You've talked, I think, about the idea of a B Corp or something like that.
That's kind of like what this is, yeah. So it's interesting because normally B Corps and CSR programs are about managing the externalities that your business produces, or like the manufacturing practices, or how the company operates itself. But there's not been a category for, does the core thing that your product does actually result in net positive improvements to people's lives? So it's sort of a new piece of corporate social responsibility or B Corp style work.
Okay, so questions? I'm just going to walk around with this.
Okay, so my question is, I'm just curious what your organization Empowering Design does and what your goals are towards getting towards this future vision.
Yeah, awesome. So I've been working on this for a long time and have gone through many cycles of not knowing what to do, because this is really, I always use the organic food metaphor because it's similar in that until organic was a thing, consumers didn't even know to question where their food came from. It's like, oh, food is food. Like, just an apple's an apple. It doesn't really matter where it comes from, what the supply chain looks like, how the, so I think that the first part of this is that consumers need to understand what the situation is. They don't know where their technology comes from, what the goals are for many attention economy companies are, not because those companies are evil or bad or wrong, but that's just that the position or contract that they're in. So the first thing I think is to create a new consumer conversation, which is basically, how can we get a distribution platform of millions and millions of people who just can be sort of led through the problem? I I've been unsuccessful at that. I've given a TED Talk and I've done some other things. I think we need to do more. Empowering Design specifically is a resource for a community of designers that we're trying to pull together. So almost like there was a communities of practice so that farmers who were doing the organic version of farming could come together and define what that would look like and what that would mean. So there's sort of standard practices. We kind of need something like that to teach designers. So we've actually held design meetups. We did 2 at Civic Hall. We've run some in Berlin and London and San Francisco, trying to bring designers together to teach them what would be an empowering representation. We might actually, maybe we'll do one next week. I was just at Meetup yesterday, and they're interested in doing one potentially next Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, let me know, and maybe we'll organize that. But that's what that website is. You had a question?
I have the mic.
Oh, sorry. I'll do it after.
You just addressed part of this question, but the word I kept thinking about is literacy.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, so mostly you were in the talk focused on the producer side of this, you know, what are the people who are making these things thinking about? But then you were just talking a little about the consumer side. And I'm just wondering what you think is, there's like, I think 2 pieces of that. One is sort of a media literacy, people just being aware of these issues and thinking about the tricks that get played on them and being savvy to it. Mm-hmm. But the other side is the sort of, I guess, sort of hacker-maker mentality, which is that like, why are they building those tools for us? Why can't we build those tools for ourselves and getting more people, giving more people tools and the power to do it themselves, which I think would probably not wind up with you know, products like that.
Yeah, the challenge with doing it ourselves is that so much of the things that we'd want to change, there's a few problems. One is which we don't have control to create a marketplace of tools that sit between you and some of these problems, right? Like Apple, for example, locks down the lock screen. So you can't change how your basic phone screen works, which means that everyone's just in a bind. So the only innovation or kind of cool independent hacker stuff you can do is after that step. But the core problems are actually at the very, very root of the screen. And so I think there's almost like a missing, this is sort of what I meant by a universal right to your attention. Or there's like a missing area of freedom that people should have to be able to affect or do this sort of innovation at these core interfaces. Email or social networks are also like that, right? Text messaging, you can't, you could start a new text messaging network, but there are network effects to the existing ones that everyone does rely on, and to modify, what ideally you would want is to modify those. So for example, the chat example I gave of focus mode, you know, you could say, oh, that's cool, I'll build an app that does that. No, it has to be built into one of the major platforms at the root of it. And so that's why I think this is we need to demand changes from, you know, the bigger players, unfortunately. There are some areas where some small things can help. I think like people can innovate in calendars, and there's some other smaller opportunities, but the big areas I think we need to affect unless people are going to start a new mobile phone handset company, and that's another thing. But.
Hi. I feel like there are 2 things that you talked about. First, kind of the demand side, where you want consumers to go to the time well spent websites or apps, for instance. Another one, which would be the supply side, try to give incentives to the businesses to become more focused on time well spent. Mm-hmm. And so you talked about CSR, for instance, and you have now investors like hedge funds, for instance, who want to invest only in CSR's businesses. And so, but to have that, they need to have a label, but also kind of an index. And so you talked about in Google Analytics having an index. And I'm thinking about the GDP analogy that you gave. And what the problems with GDP is that nearly all economists, on the contrary to what nearly everyone thinks, all economists know it's a bad measure, but I used to do economics, so we haven't found a good way to measure it, to measure something more comprehensive than GDP. Even all the indexes that we have are either too subjective or really difficult to compute, and so we still rely on GDP. We know it's a bad one, but it's the only one. Still now we haven't found an objective definition of happiness that could be this great index. And so do you have an idea of what kind of index could be used?
Yeah.
And thank you.
Well, this goes back to the very first point, right, which is that all maps are never the territory. And the critical thing is there self-awareness or doubt or questioning about what the vulnerabilities of this particular map that we're using, which could be GDP or could be an idea or a design goal, what that goal might be vulnerable to. So that's the first thing. Whatever we come up with, we would know would never capture the underlying territory of net positive human impact. I could name a billion ways of describing that, and it would never capture what was true for everybody. But the whole point of that last slide was that there are upgrades we can make, and there are certainly certain ways of measuring that that might be better than the current way. Currently, I think the way to measure time well spent, and I'm kind of like, there's a collaborator of mine in Berlin who's been working on this. He was the CTO of Couchsurfing, who is responsible for that metric I showed you. And he's working on a Chrome extension that basically shows people a reflection of your use. So it says, okay, here's the websites you used, a bunch. And then it asks you some questions about whether or not you got what you came for, and tries to get at what a time well spent score looks like. The best way to do this is not to have me or my friend Joe or anybody say we know what the answer is. It's to have like a consortium of people who are sort of experts in subjective well-being, which is a whole area of psychology and behavioral economics, and the people who are experts in those measures to come together and try to create that standard. And it should be obviously a nonprofit that or some kind of benefit type oriented entity that is all about measuring that in a standardized way so that you can create these new standard metrics. But really important point, to do that, you would need a reflection of what people are currently spending time on. I can't rate how I feel about something unless I see what I've been doing. So there's a key area of missing freedom here too, which is that there's no way for, especially on an iPhone, on any iOS device, to get back all the time that I spent across the different things. There's no way to pull that data out. So there's a missing like data freedom about where was my usage or time spent on my phone. I can't get that. You could hack it on Android. It'd be nice for some people to help do that. It'd be nice to do this across, to unify the data picture from Chrome and other web browsers so that you can basically pull it all into one unified package. Someone needs to know that Facebook wasn't just the Facebook app use, it was the website use, and it was the tablet browser use, and you have to be able to unify all that together. And so one problem is we don't have the ability to pull that data together because there's actually missing freedoms that the platforms aren't giving people. That would be part of the list of demands of sort of a time well spent movement, right? Is we need to be able to have the basic data so then we can ask questions. In the meantime, there's some smaller things you can do, like showing people a reflection of their web usage and ask people just to get some baseline number of how that feels so far. And then once you had that, like you said, to make it actionable, the idea is not that there's this app store where suddenly a person's about to pick up an app and look at it. Oh, that doesn't have the label. I want the one that has the label. It's not that. It's the idea that in your experience of the internet, things are automatically marked and reorganized according to time well spent preferences. So it's not like you're doing this extra conscious choice-making work. It's like the world is working for you based on the data that exists about what does improve people's lives. I hope that answers your question.
Well, I want to live in
yeah.
that world. That sounds amazing.
I know this sounds utopian, by the way, but I'm trying to anchor at utopia so that when we get back to the things that we could do, it would be practical. But
Loved your presentation. I especially like the framework and your analogy of imagining this community landscape with the stoplight. And it made me think of this recent essay that came out by Umar Haque, which is Why Twitter's Dying. And it's all about online harassment. And so,
that's a good phrase.
And thinking about online harassment, and your analogy is really like being verbally harassed on the street or threatened. And I had a very personal example happen this morning with one of Reported Girl's story contributors. It was not on our platform, but on a separate space. Some really heavy victim blaming, minimization from this male individual towards one of our story contributors. And I reached out to her. She lives in Tanzania right now, but she told me she had a panic attack because of it. And so my question is sort of, from your perspective, how can you imagine putting that lens to harassment?
Totally.
And
I have a concrete example of that. Facebook actually has a team. I'm not, by the way, anti-Facebook in any way. They actually have a really great team that I forgot what they call it. They used to call it the compassion team, and then they got in a lot of trouble because people wanted to know what that meant. I think they now call it like the trust and safety team. And there's a guy named Arturo Bahar who basically he integrated all the principles of nonviolent communication and compassion and the Greater Good Science Center in Berkeley, which does positive psychology research, and found out that there was a lot of cyberbullying going on within Facebook. So specifically, teenagers post photos of friends they're trying to humiliate, and then tag them in those photos. And then the person who is tagged and wants that photo taken down hits report photo, and it creates this huge volume of customer service requests for Facebook. So what his team did is they basically used the principles of nonviolent communication, so that when the person says report photo, it asks that person first, how did that make you feel? Which is the first step of nonviolent communication. And once they got that, then they had a pre-populated message that basically it sort of like helped them assemble a way of talking to that person who was the bully. And they were able to increase the takedown rate of photos by like 70%. And they also cut customer service inquiries by a huge amount. Don't quote me on 70%, you can look it up. But the idea was that there are principles that are sort of social design principles, very similar to what I'm doing here. The idea with the chat is that there's an underlying preference between two people. People don't want to, it's not that I always want to interrupt you and that I want to ding you in the head every single time I have something to say. It's that I didn't know that you have some underlying preference and I didn't know your state. And I also, and the other person, like want to know if I'm missing something important. But if you can gather that underlying preference and then like help coordinate a better way of both people communicating, that's really what marriage counselors and couples counseling and nonviolent communication are about. So I think there are some design principles that would be included, or should be included in some kind of empowering design framework that says there's a whole social part of empowering design that's about basically like applying nonviolent communication principles to software. And that should someone should do that for comment sites and a whole bunch of things like that.
Hi. Sorry. Hi. I just wanted to say first that I appreciate the focus on the user and the effort to construct systems that are sensitive to the user's desires and needs. But I wanted to ask a question that I think it might sound mean, and I don't want for it to, but I want to push you a little bit on the idea of empowerment. Mm-hmm. So when I heard that you were going to talk about empowering design, this is not honestly what I thought empowerment was about. Because I think there's kind of two things that can happen, right? One thing is that the empowerment, as you describe it, like most of the examples that you've given are in the context of like white collar work, right? Like I want to set up a meeting, like I don't want to bother this person asking for a report while they're checking their email, right? Or like, oh, maybe we want to burn a couple extra calories, walking around. Like it assumes a subject who's like a very particular kind of subject, right? Somebody who has presumably a lot of autonomy and freedom in their work already, who like where those are the concerns, those are the big concerns are like, am I getting an email I don't want right now? So that's like one possibility, is that this is just not relevant to a large swath of people. Then the other possibility that worries me more is that there's a very fine line between personalization and like prescription and paternalism and choice making for people, like in the name of empowerment. I'm sure this is something you've thought about like extensively. I'm not trying to say that this isn't something that's within your ambit, but right, like we see this a lot where, first of all, personalization by default requires a lot more surveillance and data collection from people. And this almost always happens in an imbalanced way, right? So that people who are marginalized or disempowered get more data collected about them in the name of some public good. So like the best example of this I can think of is this medical program, actually, where we know that like women who speak to their babies a lot, like those babies do a lot better. So like the big like Silicon Valley bright idea was like, well, let's start recording like everything that happens in these women's homes so that we know, like, so that we can help them, right? We can empower them to make better choices and say more words out loud, right? Like forgetting that this involves basically just like wholesale surveillance of these women. So I'm really worried about that line. And I think, in some ways it's akin to what Adam suggested about like who's making the choices, right? Like you displayed this slide of these 4 bearded young Brooklyn guys making choices, and like you're kind of also just like a bearded. I always make that.
No, yeah, totally.
You seem like a good dude, right? But like, I feel like you always are going to run into that, right? When like the people making the design decisions are making them for someone else.
Exactly. Yeah. So many good points you're bringing up. So one thing, obviously, is that those people who work at those tech companies who make those choices, they can't not make that choice. There's no way I can be like, I'm not going to make a choice. What's viewed as paternalism is often just moving away from whatever was before. It's sort of like there's a cognitive bias there. I forgot what it's called. It's basically when we assume that how things were when we first just accidentally or intuitively made some choice was like better than anything we might change it to. And so as soon as you want to change it, it's like, well, who are you to say that that's better for people? And then you're bringing up another important point, which is that you're right, that basically, let's see. So the frame for what you're talking about is fundamentally that there is a finite amount of choices people can make in a day. So one way to view this entire problem is there's a finite amount of time or attention. Another way to view it is there's a finite amount of choice-making energy people have. So that's why choice is like high. It's a representation that's both hinting at truth but then lying to us, right? Because I can saturate you with choices, and then I'm just burning you down, and then you're basically just like running with the default choices of the world, and that's actually how a lot of people in the world get impoverished, because you just burn people down so they have nothing left, and all they can do is reach for the easy thing. So there's something that Cass Sunstein, who's the Obama's behavioral economics advisor and wrote Nudge, calls choices about choices, or meta-choice design, where designers have to be in the position of making choices about which choices you should have and which choices are not important to you. So to address your point about empowering, what empowering means, I totally see that that's a word that hints at lots of, like scatters across lots of different domains that are not, that might be ambiguous. But the idea of empowering choices is that of the choices we are putting in front of you, they're the ones that matter to that person's life. And it certainly isn't white collar work and whether or not it's like a walking calorie counter or something else, right? It's like the idea that the person who most needs to, there's a simple savings account that someone might want to open, but they're just so burned down and distracted by all this other noise that they don't even like have that choice on life's menu because of their environment that they're in or something like that. So there are definitely smaller sets of empowering choices that relate to core needs that your phone could be putting in front of you. This probably already sounds paternalistic. It's not where I'm intending. What I meant to say is that there's fundamentally sets of choices that we are going to put in front of you, and by doing so, we're going to be crowding out other choices. So there has to be a discussion and some transparency about which choices we will put in front of you. The last thing, which is a really important point you brought up about this new social contract, that to put empowering choices in front of you, I probably have to know more about you, not less about you.
Or be more like me, or like actually be a represented user, like a woman or
Yep.
color.
Right. Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it requires more empathy. So if I don't have information about you, it just requires lots of empathy and pre-planning on the part of the designer, not knowing if they don't have personal data. If they do have personal data, they can tune those choices to be more appropriate for that person, what they're after. But again, then you ask them do people even know what they want in the first place? And they don't. And so, I mean, a lot of people don't. This is at least the counter criticism I get a lot. It's like, well, who are you to say? Because people won't even know what they'll want out of these services. So you have to make a choice on behalf of them anyway. I want to get to his question though, sorry.
I was wondering if you could say a little more about how you imagine the business model working for news organizations with this, because I feel like at news organizations, we're not even at the time spent economy in so many cases. We're on the click economy. Mm-hmm. And I've worked at organizations that will remain nameless, where they've explicitly prioritized writing 5 short articles over one 2,000-word feature.
Yep.
So I feel like editors at news organizations would actually be thrilled if they could monetize time spent, and actually get paid more from advertisers for feature articles than short news hits. So that's the first part, and then like what does time well spent add for news organizations, and how would that work?
So you're bringing up a great point, which is there's this representation that's essentially the power system of news. And the power system of clicks yields very different results than a power system of time spent, than a power system of time well spent. So in a power system of clicks, people will have to there'll be this race to the bottom of the brainstem to get whatever makes clicks happen, which means writing shorter articles, slideshows instead of long posts, share buttons at the top, etc. I'm curious, though, what you mean, because I know that Chartbeat and a lot of the news organizations, which I have some familiarity with, are migrating towards like overall engagement time spent on the course of the website, just because that. Are you talking about advertiser clicks or the? Right, but there are some correlations around, like if you're just like briefly popping in and popping out, advertisers view that site as less compelling or less engaging, and so they tend to value those CPMs less. But anyway, so in terms of actually changing that, like the idea of a time well spent world would be a person sort of filling out some profile of what time well spent means to them. which could include, for example, weight classes of articles. So for example, right now, there's this sort of like everyone's competing. Imagine like a wrestling match where like the skinniest, scrawny guy is always competing with like the biggest guy who's like super big and heavy or something. Like it's sort of like not the right comparison to be making. Similarly, if you're the journalist who wants to write the 25-minute long story that you really want to do the deep research for, you will totally get killed by the internet economy if that's what you're doing with your website. So imagine though that person can say, I'm actually a time well spent news site for 25-minute, long form articles. And then people, when there's sort of a reflection of their behavior, it sort of says, here's how much is happening in, 2-minute soundbite articles. Here's how much is happening for you. Like here's where you're spending your time right now. And 2-minute soundbites. Here's where you're spending your time in, 5-minute articles. And here's where you're spending your time with the long reads or whatever. What is time well spent for you? And then once you say that preference, these publishers that are doing the thing that they think is good for people, that would be time well spent for the 25 minutes, suddenly get thrown into that person's feed. So you can imagine like creating distinctions that don't exist, weight classes for content. That's one thing. But it also, of course, it's not just about the length, it's about what are people after. So am I after understanding Syria? It's like, well, I'm after understanding Syria in a deep way, and I want to spend like 45 minutes on that this week or something like that. Well, the person can say, maybe you should actually not even be on the internet. Here's this like great person you should talk to that's next to you, right? And that's what time well spent is, the global set of choices that would be best for you to help fulfill what you're after, which could include in many cases not the screen. Just to be super clear, this isn't just about optimizing the screen. It's about whatever would be best for that person for the thing that they're after.
We've got just over 10 minutes left and a few questions still, so I'll ask everyone to just slightly shorten themselves.
Sorry, it's my fault for speaking so long for each answer. But.
So thank you. That was that was a great, wonderful presentation. I wanted to offer a thought on the idea of maybe something you might call algorithmic fiduciaries. And I'm thinking of, if you think about one of the challenges we have in some of the questions is the issue of that kind of subjective to objective movement, kind of the group privacy idea, right? My individual, is it sufficiently represented, my individual interest and group interest? And we have so many in groups, you have so many overlying agenda that's often hard to map it directly. What I'm wondering is if you look at perhaps what you're describing, and this gentleman over here was talking about gross domestic product, in market economies, we do have a service layer now of fiduciaries. So investment advisors under the 40 Act are fiduciaries, broker-dealers aren't. Lawyers have an ethical construction where they're supposed to act on behalf of their clients, for instance.
Right.
It feels like what you're talking about is anticipating
Yeah.
an idea of really an algorithmic or fiduciary layer where privacy and individual interests are represented.
That's right.
You're always going to have that issue of the representation doing a form of abstraction as violence to a person,
Yep.
and for non-physical violence, privacy violence.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if that's something that it feels like that it does feel like a comfortable fit in terms of that notion of essentially an algorithmic fiduciary that's being offered here.
So you're saying basically there should be some way of encoding that this, if a time well spent, if Facebook says I'm time well spent now, it has to prove its fiduciary
Doing it
prior to your interests.
I think you're doing it by asking people, was this good for you? And so
Right.
essentially you're saying intrinsically,
Yes.
you think of all the people who earn money, so it's hard-edged market stuff,
Yeah.
but they earn money on how well they do representing the interests of others. That their job is not to that's a conflict of interest
Right,
issue, of course.
right, exactly. Yeah, totally. I mean, and like you're saying, it's sort of show, don't tell. So you're doing it by the practice of it, not doing it by the claiming of it. So one is like, oh, I can claim that I'm aligned for you. This is what happens already today. People at Facebook or at other companies, it's like, oh, I'm just helping people live their life. And what does that mean? So I think part of this is you should be, in a time well spent world, you're transparent about what that report looks like. So there's a transparent way that you're saying, if I am measuring your outcome, here's how I'm doing it. There's issues there about whether or not you can disclose the performance of that, because that can make people look bad. So we don't want to shame companies who might not be very good yet, but who are measuring it. So I think, one thought I had was there should be a time well spent index of just showing all these companies how they're measuring net positive improvement to people's lives. Here's Couchsurfing's way. Flux, the thing that removes blue light from your screen late at night that helps you sleep better. That's 15 minutes times 15 million users equals this many hours of new positive sleep in the world. So there's companies that do have metrics like that. There's not that many, but part of what this would be is how can we put them together so they have a shared voice. Yeah. One other thing I should mention is, more questions. Yeah.
Hi, I study learning, and so I see a lot of these tech fixes in the learning context and a lot of well-meaning interventions in tech. And I guess my question is, it seems that we're considering that human problems have tech fixes. And that seems to be an assumption, that if we don't know how to spend our time well, there must be a tech fix for that. And what I've seen in learning that is a concern for me is that what ends up happening is we reduce the problem down to what can be measured by tech and what can be addressed by tech.
Yep.
And so I was just wondering how you were thinking about that.
Totally. So just to be super clear, you're bringing up some great points. This might sound like, oh, we just need technology just running everything every moment, just helping people spend time well. That's not quite what this is about. It's about what would be best for that person to accomplish what they're after. So if you're trying to learn, like I said before, about Syria, and there's like these New York Times articles, and New York Times is like, no, I'm great for people learning about Syria. But maybe the thing that works best is that person talking to their like Syrian neighbor that's down the street or something like that. So what the idea would be that ideally you're ranking things by what just most fulfills that process for that person, which is not technology oriented. But I did want to say something about you're mentioning that we need the view that we need technology to solve these problems. One thing that gets missed in these conversations is people say, well, hold on a second, shouldn't people just make their own choices and self-regulate? Isn't it up to them to self-regulate their willpower and their choices because like they're in charge? And every single time there's a lapse in willpower or self-regulation, people are like, oh, that's my fault. As opposed to, do we realize there's 100 of the smartest engineers, statisticians, designers on the other side of the screen whose job it is every day is to break that. So you can meditate all you want, but the job of all those people is to break whatever you cultivate. And so that's a huge power imbalance, right? And so when we make this a question of like individual choice making, that actually is the thing that's being kind of compromised, is autonomy. Like the ability to have a meaningful choice making environment that honors your autonomy, that is informing your choices, that is setting up menus that are not just drowning you in more and more choices, but like a minimal set of empowering choices that align with what you actually want, or what would be good for that person or that student in that environment. Hopefully that sort of gets at some of the things. I mean, learning, I'm not proposing that there should just be like learning apps everywhere or something like that, just to be super clear. There are, I know there are. That's part of what I'm trying to address, because what happens there is that you have learning tech companies that throw around nice sounding catchphrases about how we're revolutionizing learning, and where's the check and balance saying that that's good? I mean, that's actually happening for people, and that's better than something else that just could be a human to human connection.
Hi. I'm way back here. So in some ways, I'm going to be asking, I think, the same question again, but I wanted to bring it back to where you started, which was with BJ Fogg and persuasive tech. And I mean, I think, so I've read some of that stuff, and I think it's really fascinating and really prescient if you've read the stuff that he wrote, like pre-iPhone, that talks about, cell phone stuff. But so one of the things that I'm wondering, though, is that in a lot of that work, it's sort of talking about the way that you can address sort of much more basic needs, right? So it's saying like, you want to become healthier. How can you sort of harness the power of this thing that you carry around with yourself all the time to do that? And I think for me, this goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And I think that a lot of the things that you've been talking about are much more towards the top of that pyramid, right? So they're much more about, self-actualization, about, self-esteem, about love and belonging, and much less about these much more basic needs that I'm hearing some questions from the audience about like safety, and, just your basic surviving and being in the world. And so I'm wondering if sort of from that lens, you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think I just did a bad job of choosing examples. I totally see how there's this perception of like, look at the white guy with the beard, who's the Brooklyn guy, who's talking about like fancy examples of people having the highest form of self-actualized, needs. So that's just a bad call that I'm making. I think that there's lots of, so I have friends who are in the behavioral economics. I'm friends with all the people who are doing behavioral economics interventions in the world. So Dan Ariely, who wrote Predictably Irrational, if many of you know that book, the woman who works with him is a close friend of mine, and they're doing all these interventions at lower levels of the stack of choice architectures and persuasion to do things like prize-linked savings accounts, so that when you put money in a savings account, they're using a slot machine reward mechanic, so that when you put a little bit of money in, every time there's a chance you could get a lot more money for your savings account. And this turns out to like totally increase like rates of savings for people. And that sounds like, well, that's manipulative. You're manipulating what people are saving. But this is, again, every environment. There is no world in which there's not persuasion. So the question is, how would you certify that this persuasion is in my interest, that it has that fiduciary responsibility that he was talking about? I think in the future, I'm just taking a point to use examples that will be more in the domain of maybe human-to-human empathy and harassment issues, and ways that the basic screen on your phone could actually just help you create space. Like one thing I'm not showing is examples I have elsewhere where your phone cannot be amplifying the technology in your life, but actually like inviting you, do you want to disconnect? So for example, when you go to bed late at night, willpower is like the lowest right before going to bed. And your screen could be like, do you want to start your shutdown routine for going to bed? And when you do that, it puts you into this sort of like linear mode of like, first you set your alarm, second it asks you, like you set your own routine, like maybe it's like your intentions for tomorrow. And the third thing is the phone just turns off. So it prevents that like going to those apps that you don't want to be going to late at night, right? And that's sort of like, there's a whole bunch of design patterns that are about simple things like that, like better sleep, creating more space to focus, things like that I think would benefit people.
Okay, I'm going to suggest as well that there's something in this movement that could be seen to reflect the kind of the relationship between Silicon Valley and government, the sort of the whole libertarian issue in the United States, because most government policy that isn't passing laws to prevent you from doing things is about persuasion. Yep. It's about the taxes that are charged. It's about the urban spaces that are created.
That's right.
It's all about incentivizing people to do things in different ways.
Yep.
And so it seems as if there's an argument coming out of a place like Silicon Valley that says something like, we might know better than the government does what is best for people. And maybe they're right. I mean, maybe, the tech companies have certain better techniques for getting more granular about what people want, and at the same time they have more powers. I mean,
and they're only going to be as good as whatever representations are running in their brain when they're thinking about that.
Right.
And yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I would say that at least with government, there's public transparency and accountability about, we're about to enact this bill that's going to do this thing to credit card bill sign-up systems. And so now people who sign up for a credit card, the default choice will be this instead of this. And that's transparent, even though it gets drowned out in our current media environment. Whereas in this case, literally, people are making these choices every day and affecting what billions of people do. And there is no transparency, because to show it would be to also reveal trade secrets. And one last thing I want to say, because this is the Big Data and Society Institute, issues like surveillance and privacy and things like this get a lot of attention right now, because they automatically tap into another cognitive bias that you have, which is the moral trigger of like, someone is like spying on me, right? And so we automatically freak out and care about that. But no one cares about hidden power that actually is affecting your day-to-day experience of life, minute to minute. Like, probably 30% of your day might get spent on in front of a screen, and no one's questioning the fact that like, this is deeply affecting your life, and it's not necessarily where you want to go, and we can change it. And so I think that this is an underrepresented issue in the sort of space of issues that often get talked about. I just want to leave you with that, because I think that's an important thing to kind of like to amplify. And according to the others, it had the same ranking as privacy and surveillance and other big topic issues.
I'm actually going to ask you to leave us with one more thing. Just take one more minute. And so there's a kind of theory of change that you've alluded to various parts of throughout the talk. So I don't know if you want to just kind of summarize, like, what are the bits and pieces that have to happen in your view for this to become a new paradigm?
Yeah. Thank you for asking to do that. I love your help. I don't know what I'm doing. This is not me. This is like at all. This is just I care about a lot of this, and I kind of want to pull together the people that care about it to be working on it. What needs to happen? Well, I want to make a distinction first between two levels of actors. So there's the actors that are in the attention economy. So there's like the Facebook and the Twitter and YouTube and the people who are in the attention economy, and their shareholders depend on them to maximize the amount of engagement that they do. They can't escape that game. That's one set of actors. That there's some change that can happen there, which I'll get to. The other set, though, are the access portals through which you access the attention economy. So these are neutral access portals, which are your mobile phone, your web browser, and the neutral messaging applications that you might use, so email and text messaging.
So neutral and heavy scare quotes for all of these, obviously.
What's that?
Neutral and heavy scare quotes for all of these things.
Neutral, yeah, I didn't mean neutral in terms of not biased. I just meant that, so to put it more specifically, your mobile phone manufacturers don't require you to spend every minute of your life on your mobile phone screen. They don't make money from every minute that you spend on that screen. The people who make that, same thing with your browser. It's not like Safari or Internet Explorer makes more money the more time you spend in your browser. They're just designed in a slightly less empowering way right now that's not giving you as much control as you might like about where you spend your time. Same thing with your mobile home screen. So from the biggest access portal actors, we can demand design changes that put you in more control of how you spend your time and what's coming at you, and demanding new standards. To do that, people don't know how to demand for that because they've never seen what that looks like. So we need to basically show a picture of what that looks like, increase the awareness for consumers that that's possible, and then the big companies can respond to that need. So right now, what's happening with privacy? Privacy is a fire, so Apple and Google and the big companies are like having to respond to that. They have to respond to that because it's a fire that they have to put out. So this is not a fire. So people at the biggest companies are not changing the mobile phone screen and the browsers to fix it. So if this wants to be changed, we have to basically make it an issue, like a consumer issue, just like organic was, to change those access portals. That's like the easier short-term thing to do.
And then this includes demanding transparency for user data and things like that.
That could include those kinds of things too. Yeah.
Right.
So the theory of change is consumers need to understand the problem that this is happening and why it's happening to them. Consumers need to demand a set of changes from the access portals, and then the access portals can change and improve the design to help people be more in control of their attention and their time.
All right. Thank you very much, Tristan.
Cool. Thanks.